Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. A real pleasure to have you here with us at the 81st Venice Film Festival. I guess by way of introduction, maybe you'd like to introduce the film for people who don't know anything about Familiar Touch. What can they expect?
Thanks so much for having us. Familiar Touch is a coming of old age film that tells the story of Ruth and her transition to an assisted living facility. But more than telling the story of that transition, it's really about the continuity of who she is as a person and her desires and sense of self in this moment of transition.
It's about the persistence of life. People make assumptions about the way people feel and how they behave, or how they perhaps ought to behave in old age. And Ruth is a trickster.
And Sarah, maybe you can take us back to what gave you sort of the original inspiration for the story. I know you did some work in a caregiving facility and it sort of changed your perspective on people suffering from dementia, people facing old age. So what was that like, and what was the journey to making the film?
Yeah, I mean, the first inspiration for it came from my paternal grandmother, who was an intellectual and a poetry editor and had a very sharp verbal acuity. And my family really valued the way that she used language. And when she developed dementia, started speaking about her as if she was no longer there. And yet she was incredibly physically expressive. And at the time, I was starting to study dance. And so that kind of contrast between her physical expression and her verbal self really stuck with me. Many years later, I started working as a caregiver for older artists and creatives with memory loss. And the thing about that job that really changed my perspective on aging, and not just aging, but just humanity in general, is that my clients didn't see me as their younger friend, their younger care worker, but often spoke to me as a peer. And it really stuck with me, this idea that age identity is more malleable than we think it is. Not just for people who are older, but for all of us, that we're able to access our child self, our teenage self, and sort of have this experience of kind of self-accumulation and be able to kind of move through those parts of ourselves in the present moment. And so with Ruth, I really wanted to kind of bring that malleable age identity into her character in this moment of transition. But then that, I guess, to go back, that job led to me teaching filmmaking to older adults in community centers and assisted living facilities. And that teaching artist practice really informed how we made the film, which was done in collaboration with Villa Gardens, a retirement community in Pasadena, California, where we engaged their whole, all the residents there as well as the staff.
And for you, Kathleen, what really appealed to you about taking on this role of Ruth? And I guess, what is your approach, both for you as an actress, but maybe together as a collaboration of crafting this character, maybe from a composite of all your great-grandmother and other people that you'd met?
As soon as I read it, I knew I wanted to do it. I was moved by Ruth's character, and it's a time that my best friend has dementia. And I saw and it's been going on for quite some time, and I've lived with her through it. And I watched the ways in which this thing happens that Sarah talks about, in which her age is malleable. I think when the guardrails go away, we don't worry so much about being appropriate. And also, at that time in your life, you live in the moment. One of the things about memory loss, short-term memory loss, is that you are living in the present. And a wonderful thing that Sarah's done in this movie, I hadn't seen it before yesterday, and I finally saw it. When you watch the movie, you feel as though you're Ruth, because the movie thinks the way Ruth does. And it's a wonderful accomplishment. And I have to say that our collaboration has been one of the most important artistic collaborations in my life. Particularly because it's true I work in the theater most of the time, and in the theater, the performer is responsible for all of it because you're on the stage no matter what size the part. In the movies, you have to trust the person who sees, because the thing doesn't exist if no one takes a picture of it. And then if someone does take a picture of it and doesn't put it in the movie, it doesn't exist either. So you must entirely trust the person who's making those choices. From the first day, I trusted Sarah that way.
And that was going to be my next question, actually, is how significant it is that it is from Ruth's perspective, because there are other films that sort of deal with the subject matter, but you know, it is sort of as an outsider gazing in, whether that's a younger family member or a friend, and perhaps there's more of a sense of sadness and pity, whereas there's kind of this sense of fun, almost by being in Ruth's shoes. You know, she sat in the canteen, so, can I see a menu? You know, what's going on here? And when she's reciting the recipe. So is that really important to you, to kind of flip that gaze and also flip the tone of a film like this?
Very much so. I mean, I think from my experiences working with older adults, noticing the difference between how their children and grandchildren spoke about their experience and how the person I was caring for existed in the present moment, as Kathy was saying, and noticing the sense of sort of disinhibition that wasn't just a symptom of a disease or an experience of aging, but was just something kind of emotional that they were going through. Feeling like the films that captured this moment in life, this coming of age moment, didn't honor that experience, that they spoke to an experience of decline, of losing oneself, of fading away. And that wasn't what I saw in the older adults I was spending time with. That yes, maybe cognitively they were experiencing a form of decline, but not in their self-expression, not in who they were. And really wanting to create a film that attuned to the sense of self of Ruth that was from her perspective. And I think a big piece of that for me in thinking about a sort of anti-ageist gaze in the film was attuning to Ruth's body and attuning to her sexuality. I think one of the most sort of infantilizing tropes in how we look at older adults is to see them as without sexuality. And if they do, it's the butt of a joke. And so I really wanted to attend to Ruth's body, both in terms of how she makes sense of the world around her, but also in terms of her desires, because I think that's one of the most important forms of humanity, that we have desire for connection, for sexuality, for touch. And so I really wanted the film's language to attune to her sense making.
And for you, playing Ruth, did you have, you know, with that sense of fun that's there, have a favourite scene or a favourite line? And on the flip side, were there elements of playing the character that you did find challenging, having to connect to that idea perhaps that, you know, you wouldn't remember who your son was? You know, it could probably be like staring into an abyss as well. So there's kind of a double-edged element to it.
Oddly, the most difficult scene was the betrayal scene, when she's, running through the garage in despair. To honor the reality of that in Ruth's life was very important, and and that was the hardest thing to do. I loved the dancing. I loved dancing with Steve at the end. It was great. And I loved the as many F words as you can think of in a minute, which was improvised. Improvised.
The only direction was to get a PH word.
Yes, a
few seconds. Yeah.
So it was wonderful to make. We had fun making it, and we had to make it pretty quickly because we made it in the month before the strike.
And of course, the fact that you brought in these border characters, you know, who really were in the home, that must have been such an incredible experience, but not without its challenges. And then maybe there was quite a contrast from, you know, directing non-actors to, of course, someone who is a veteran performer. So what was your approach in making all that work?
As I mentioned, because I come from a teaching artist background, we set up a workshop at Villa Gardens in the 5 weeks before filming. And so by the time that we started filming the feature, we had already basically been in residence for 2 months at Villa Gardens. And so the entire community, residents and staff, knew us. And the workshop allowed the residents to really learn what facets of filmmaking they were interested in, and then to join our cast and crew in the area of their interest and passion. And so what that meant was that by the time I yelled action for the first shot of the film, everybody sort of found their place in our film, and it didn't feel like, I think a lot of films feel like sort of an army moving into a space and then you shoot and then you leave it kind of roughed up and destroyed. And in our case, we really treated it as if we were guests in this, both a workplace and a home, and made sure that we were behaving as guests. But what was beautiful was how embraced we were by this community. So it really felt like by the time we were filming, we lived there with them. And so it wasn't actually that different directing. It felt very integrated.
And some of them were actors.
And some of them had acted before. And I should say, Kathy, this film is my first time directing professional actors. In my shorts, I'd primarily worked with non-professional performers and dancers and a few actors, but they were my best friends, and so it was different. And so for me, it was just extraordinary to work with Kathy and Carolyn Michelle and Andy McQueen and H. John Benjamin, because all of them showed me so much trust, but also I learned from them. You know, it was a wonderful, it was such a masterclass getting to work with her and to feel both mentored and trusted at the same time. So I don't know, the combination of this sort of hybrid production model and getting to work with one of the greatest actors on the planet, if I may say so myself, you'll be embarrassed, but it was a wonderful integration.
And for you, was it, astounding to think, oh, this is Sarah's first film or first time directing a feature?
It's odd because the work is sort of like industrial work, particularly in a movie that I think I was only not in. I worked every day, but there were about 4 scenes of the movie that I wasn't in. So otherwise, I was there all the time, and you don't have time, in for a penny, in for a pound. And it never, ever felt as though we were under the gun, as though there were any notion that we wouldn't get it. And that was true of everybody, of the crew. I think part of the sense of security we had is that Sarah's crew, the basic crew, were people that Sarah has worked with for 10 years. Particularly the cinematographer and our production designer. And so it felt as though everyone knew what they were doing. And they did, apparently. I just saw it yesterday. I thought it was okay.
And in terms of what you hope, the impact of a film like this might be, it's kind of the power of cinema in a way, that to be able to put the audience in someone's shoes, for a couple of hours, and how that might shift people's perspectives of maybe, friends or family they have that are aging or might be suffering from dementia, and perhaps not be so quick to put our own projected, fears of memory loss, fears of aging onto those people, but actually, like you say, still see them as the people they always were, and that they have these really strong identities.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I hope people will take away, this sense of continuity, of the continuity of who we are, that the experiences we have of aging, of memory loss, of other transitions we go through in life, don't detract from the ways in which we continue to be ourselves. And I also really hope that younger people will watch this film and identify with Ruth and see themselves in Ruth and not think of an older woman as other to them. I also hope people will come away from this changing how they value care labor. That I think one of the effects of how we devalue older adults is that we devalue caregivers, and we don't see it as a skilled profession. And I think it is the most skilled profession there is. And across the world, we're facing this huge demographic shift, and we need more care workers than ever. And so I really hope that in seeing oneself as Ruth, I hope the film can help people have conversations about their own desires for aging, and then also be able to talk about their care wishes of how they want to be cared for, where they want to be cared for. And perhaps then put some political pressure on their representatives that we need the infrastructure to have universal older adult care.
Because, as Sarah's often said, Ruth is enormously privileged. And the place, the Villa Gardens, is a place for only the privileged. And we need to make this level of care and these possibilities open to the entire society, in the same way that in schools, all the children our children are all the children, and in the same way, our grandparents need to be all the grandparents.
Do you think there's also an element of thinking about, the age of Ruth, like in terms of her generation, and it's, that wave of feminism that there was when she would have been young and feeling very empowered, and then perhaps feeling like that's been taken away again, like in terms of her autonomy, because she's got a real edge to her in that sense. She's got a real sense of strength and independence. So I think that's another sort of nuance that comes out through the film.
And she was an extremely successful person. She was she says not a chef, but a cook and a writer of cookbooks. And I think all of those things are true. She's used to being autonomous and expects it always to be the case. And it's an interesting thing that happens that Ruth learns in the course of the play, of the movie, the realistic limits of life. So that the first time she leaves, she really means to leave. The second time, she doesn't go home. She uses knives quite a lot in the movie, but we don't want people to be nervous about it, because they often say that in dementia, the last thing to go is music. But for Ruth, I think the last thing to go were her knife skills.
I think also just on the question of sort of Ruth's strengths and her autonomy, I think this is very much a feminist film, because one of the inspirations for me was looking at these films that depicted older women as sort of little old lady, as grannies, and that depiction is so at odds with the older women that I know that are sort of my mentors and elders, and wanting to pay homage to this generation of feminists who made everything possible for my generation, and to imagine who is caring for them, who is attending to their autonomy and their agency, and what that transition must feel like if they're not feeling that agency honored. The older women in my life, just the women in my life, I didn't see them represented on screen. Both of my grandmothers are sharp and vivid and brilliant, and could not be further from our idea of what a grandmother is. Yeah, in a way, I think this also comes from a desire to honor their feminism as well.
And just finally, what does it mean to you to have the film here in Venice? And like you said, seeing it up on the big screen for the first time, it sounds like, what was that moment like?
Well, part of it is, one of the things that drew us together is that we both, for different reasons, have very strong attachments to Italy. And so it couldn't have been better when Sarah called and said that we were premiering at the Venice Film Festival. After she finished screaming, I took up screaming.
But also, I don't know if you remember this, but when we wrapped production, when we were saying goodbye, you said to me, I'll see you at the Venice Film Festival. And I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, it's my first feature. And so the idea that it's premiering at Venice is just extraordinary. I associate this festival with sort of excellence in the form. And so it feels like an extraordinary honor and a sort of beautiful beginning for us.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with me. Congratulations on the film, and really enjoyed presenting it here in Venice. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
That's so great.
Chatting with
Thank you.